On the morning of March 6, 2025, what should have been the final day of a college spring break vacation became the beginning of one of the most closely followed missing person investigations in recent years. 20-year-old Sudiksha Konanki, a University of Pittsburgh student, vanished from a beach outside the RIU Republica Resort in Punta Cana, Dominican Republic. Just hours earlier, surveillance cameras had captured her walking toward the shoreline with friends after a night of celebration. Those images would become the last confirmed record of her movements. When daylight arrived, Sudiksha was gone. At first, investigators believed they were responding to another routine missing person report involving a tourist. But as the hours passed, the investigation expanded rapidly. Local police were joined by specialized rescue teams. Helicopters searched the coastline. Divers entered the ocean. Drones scanned miles of beach. Days later, the FBI joined the investigation. Despite one of the largest search operations the region had seen, no definitive answer was found. No confirmed sighting. No verified evidence explaining exactly what happened after Sudiksha was last seen walking toward the water. As investigators reconstructed the timeline, every piece of evidence seemed to answer one question while creating another. What happened during the final minutes before sunrise? Could the ocean alone explain her disappearance? Or was there something investigators had yet to uncover? Months later, the case continues to generate debate among investigators, journalists, and millions of people who have followed every development. Because despite the international attention, despite hundreds of hours of searching, and despite an investigation involving multiple agencies, one question remains unanswered. What really happened to Sudiksha Konanki? Tonight, this documentary examines the confirmed timeline, the evidence, the investigation, and the unanswered questions that continue to surround one of 2025's most mysterious disappearances. Before we begin, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue producing carefully researched true crime documentaries based on evidence, not speculation. Now, let's return to the beginning of the investigation. Before her name appeared in headlines across the world, Sudiksha Konanki was simply a 20-year-old college student with a future she had worked hard to build. She was born into a close-knit family and grew up in South Riding, Virginia, where education, discipline, and perseverance were values deeply rooted in her upbringing. Friends described her as intelligent, respectful, and driven, someone who rarely lost sight of her goals. At the time of her disappearance, Sudiksha was a student at the University of Pittsburgh, pursuing studies in biology on a pre-medical track. Like many aspiring physicians, she had spent years preparing for a career dedicated to helping others. Those who knew her never expected her name to become associated with one of the most puzzling missing person investigations of 2025. To her classmates, she was another university student balancing lectures, assignments, and campus life. To her friends, she was someone who enjoyed traveling, spending time with the people closest to her, and embracing the experiences that come with being 20 years old. To her parents, she was simply their daughter. Nothing in the weeks leading up to March 2025 suggested that anything was wrong. There were no public reports indicating that Sudiksha feared for her safety. No evidence that she planned to disappear. No indication that she intended to leave behind the life she had carefully built. By every publicly available account, she was looking forward to a short spring break vacation before returning to her studies. Like thousands of other American college students, the trip offered an opportunity to step away from the pressures of university life for just a few days. It was meant to be a brief escape, a chance to relax with friends before classes resumed. Instead, it would become the last trip she ever took. As investigators later reconstructed the timeline, they found nothing unusual about Sudiksha's life before she boarded the flight to the Dominican Republic. Everything appeared normal. And perhaps that is what makes this case so unsettling. There was no obvious warning, no clear sign that a routine college vacation would soon become an international investigation involving multiple law enforcement agencies. For investigators, understanding who Sudiksha was became an important part of understanding what may have happened to her. Because every missing person case begins with the same question: who was the person before they disappeared? For Sudiksha Konanki, that answer seemed remarkably ordinary, which made what happened next even more difficult to explain. In early March 2025, Sudiksha and 5 friends boarded a flight to Punta Cana, expecting nothing more than a week of sunshine, laughter, and memories. None of them knew that the vacation was about to take a devastating turn. In early March 2025, Sudiksha Konanki and 5 friends traveled from the United States to Punta Cana, Dominican Republic, for spring break. Like thousands of college students every year, they planned to spend a few days away from campus before returning to classes. Punta Cana was a familiar destination for American travelers. Known for its white sand beaches, luxury resorts, and warm Caribbean climate, the region welcomed millions of international visitors each year. During spring break, many of its beachfront hotels were filled with college students celebrating the brief break from academic life. The group checked into the RIU Republica Resort, an adults-only beachfront property that was hosting hundreds of guests from around the world. According to the publicly available investigation, nothing during the first days of the trip suggested that anything was out of the ordinary. Photographs and videos shared during the vacation showed friends enjoying the resort, spending time by the pool, dining together, and exploring the property. Family members later indicated that Sudiksha had remained in contact during the trip, and there were no public reports suggesting she expressed fear, concern, or a desire to leave early. To investigators, those details would later become significant. One of the first objectives in any missing person investigation is determining whether anything unusual occurred before the disappearance. In Sudiksha's case, authorities found no publicly known evidence indicating that she had planned to disappear or that she expected to encounter danger while on vacation. Everything pointed to what appeared to be a normal spring break trip. As the vacation continued, the group followed a routine familiar to many tourists staying at the resort. Days were spent enjoying the beach and resort facilities. Evenings often included restaurants, music, and entertainment organized for guests. Nothing about those activities distinguished Sudiksha's group from the hundreds of other visitors staying at the hotel. Investigators would later review photographs, digital records, and witness statements from those days. The goal was straightforward: to identify any event that might explain what happened later. According to the publicly available findings, nothing significant emerged. No reported conflicts. No documented threats. No indication that anyone in the group anticipated what was about to unfold. That absence of warning became one of the first mysteries in the investigation. Because when investigators looked back at the days leading up to March 6, everything appeared ordinary. And in many missing person cases, an ordinary beginning often makes the search for answers even more difficult. As the final evening of the vacation approached, the group made plans to spend one more night together before returning home. What happened over the next several hours would become the focus of an international investigation. The final confirmed timeline began on the night of March 5, 2025. A timeline investigators would later reconstruct minute by minute using surveillance footage, witness statements, and digital evidence. On the evening of March 5, 2025, Sudiksha Konanki and her friends spent their final night in Punta Cana at the RIU Republica Resort. Like many spring break guests, they joined other vacationers for the resort's evening entertainment before continuing the night in nearby public areas of the property. According to the investigation, nothing during the early part of the evening suggested that anything unusual was about to happen. The group remained together for much of the night, moving between different areas of the resort alongside hundreds of other guests. As the hours passed and the celebrations continued, surveillance cameras captured portions of their movements. Those recordings would later become some of the most important pieces of evidence in the investigation. Shortly before dawn on March 6th, Sudiksha was seen walking toward the beach with several other people. Among them was Joshua Riabe, another tourist staying at the resort. Investigators later confirmed that he was the last publicly known person seen with Sudiksha before she disappeared. Surveillance footage documented parts of their route through the resort toward the shoreline. However, like many beachfront properties, the camera coverage did not extend across every section of the beach. Once they moved beyond the areas covered by surveillance, the investigation entered its first major gap. According to Joshua Reabe's public statements to investigators, the two entered the water together. He later said they were caught in strong waves and that he struggled to return to shore. After reaching the beach, he stated that he believed Sudiksha had remained near the shoreline while he eventually fell asleep. When he awoke later, she was no longer there. Investigators carefully examined that account. They compared it with surveillance footage, witness interviews, digital evidence, and other information collected during the investigation. Authorities questioned Joshua Reabe multiple times as they worked to reconstruct the final known timeline. At the same time, investigators emphasized an important fact. His account represented one part of the investigation. Every statement still had to be evaluated against the available evidence. As daylight approached, the timeline became increasingly difficult to verify. No surveillance footage has been publicly released, showing Sudiksha after she walked toward the beach. No confirmed witness has publicly reported seeing her leave the shoreline, and no publicly available evidence has established exactly what occurred during those final moments before sunrise. For investigators, this was the point where the confirmed timeline ended. Everything after that depended on evidence that had yet to answer the investigation's most important question. When the sun rose over Punta Cana on the morning of March 6th, there was still no indication that a major international search was about to begin. Within just a few hours, friends realized Sudiksha was missing, and what had started as an ordinary spring break vacation was about to become one of the most closely watched missing person investigations of 2025. The first priority was no longer reconstructing the previous night. It was finding Sudiksha before time, and the elements erased the trail investigators were racing to preserve. As the morning of March 6, 2025 unfolded, the atmosphere at the RIU Republica Resort appeared no different from any other spring break morning. Guests gathered for breakfast. Vacationers headed toward the pools and beaches. Staff prepared for another day welcoming hundreds of visitors. But for one group of students, something was wrong. Sudiksha Konanki had not returned. At first, her friends believed there might be a simple explanation. Perhaps she had gone back to her room unnoticed. Perhaps she had met another friend somewhere on the property. Perhaps there had been a misunderstanding after a long night of celebrations. As the minutes passed, those possibilities became increasingly unlikely. Friends searched the resort and attempted to contact her. According to publicly available reports, there was no response. The concern quickly escalated. What had initially appeared to be a delay was now being treated as a possible emergency. Resort staff were notified, and local authorities were contacted. For investigators, every missing person case begins with one critical objective: establish the last confirmed point at which the missing individual was seen. Officers immediately began collecting information from Sudiksha's friends, resort employees, and anyone who might have interacted with her during the previous night. Investigators also moved quickly to secure surveillance footage before it could be overwritten or lost. Those recordings would later help reconstruct much of Sudiksha's final known movements through the resort. Attention soon focused on the final hours before sunrise. Who had been with her? When was she last seen? What route had she taken toward the beach? Each answer helped narrow the timeline, but none explained what happened after the cameras no longer captured her movements. Authorities also began searching the immediate area surrounding the resort. The beach where Sudiksha had last been seen became the center of the initial response. Officers walked the shoreline looking for anything that might indicate where she had gone. Personal belongings found near the beach were carefully documented as part of the investigation. At the same time, detectives worked to determine whether this was an accident, a voluntary disappearance, or something more concerning. At that stage, investigators had not reached any conclusions. Every possibility remained under consideration. As the hours continued to pass without locating Sudiksha, the investigation expanded rapidly. What had started as a local missing person report was no longer being treated as a routine search. Additional resources were requested. Search teams prepared to cover a much larger area. The urgency was increasing with every passing hour, because investigators understood something that applies to every missing person investigation. The first 24 hours are often the most critical. Evidence can disappear. Witnesses' memories begin to fade. Environmental conditions can alter a scene. Time was no longer working in their favor. By the end of the first day, one fact had become painfully clear. A university student who had arrived in Punta Cana only days earlier had vanished without a confirmed explanation. The investigation was about to grow far beyond the boundaries of a single beach resort. As local authorities requested additional support, one of the largest search operations in the Dominican Republic's recent history was beginning to take shape. By the second day of the investigation, what had begun as a local missing person report had grown into a large-scale search involving multiple agencies. Authorities in the Dominican Republic expanded their efforts well beyond the beach where Sudiksha Konanki had last been seen. Search teams moved along miles of coastline. Rescue personnel searched both land and water. Divers entered the ocean to examine areas that could not be reached from shore. Helicopters conducted repeated aerial searches, while drones surveyed sections of the coastline from above. The objective was straightforward: locate any evidence that could explain what happened after Sudiksha disappeared from public view. As the operation expanded, investigators also broadened the scope of the investigation. Surveillance footage from the resort was carefully reviewed. Detectives reconstructed Sudiksha's movements using security cameras, witness interviews, and digital records. Every confirmed sighting was placed into a detailed timeline. Investigators also interviewed resort employees, security personnel, guests, and everyone known to have spent time with Sudiksha during the hours before her disappearance. Particular attention remained focused on establishing the final verified moments of her movements. Authorities continued interviewing Joshua Reeby, the last publicly known person seen with Sudiksha. According to public statements, investigators examined his account alongside surveillance footage, witness statements, and other available evidence. As the investigation progressed, officials emphasized that every statement would be evaluated against the physical and digital evidence collected during the case. Meanwhile, specialists began examining environmental conditions along the shoreline. Ocean currents, wave activity, tides, and weather conditions were analyzed to determine whether they could have affected the search or the movement of evidence. Those assessments became an important part of the investigation, as authorities considered multiple possibilities without publicly reaching a final conclusion. As news of the disappearance spread internationally, the investigation received growing attention from the United States. Given that Sudiksha was an American citizen, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, confirmed it was assisting Dominican authorities as part of the ongoing investigation. The FBI's role included providing investigative support and coordinating with local officials as information continued to be gathered. The involvement of the FBI reflected the seriousness of the case and underscored the international cooperation taking place behind the scenes. Despite the growing number of personnel involved, the investigation faced a difficult reality. Every hour that passed reduced the likelihood of finding fresh evidence. Wind could alter the shoreline. Ocean currents could change conditions along the coast. Witnesses' memories could become less precise. Investigators understood that preserving the timeline was becoming just as important as continuing the physical search. Days passed. Search aircraft continued flying over the coastline. Divers returned to the water. Officers revisited witnesses. Investigators reviewed surveillance footage again and again, looking for even the smallest detail that might have been overlooked. Yet despite those efforts, no publicly confirmed evidence emerged, explaining exactly what happened after Sudiksha was last seen heading toward the beach. The investigation was no longer focused solely on finding a missing student. It had become an effort to answer a question that remained unresolved, despite an extraordinary commitment of resources. As the search continued, investigators began shifting from where Sudiksha disappeared to what might have happened during the final minutes of the known timeline. That transition would shape every stage of the investigation that followed. As the physical search continued, investigators entered another critical phase of the case. Finding Sudiksha remained the highest priority. But at the same time, detectives were working to answer another question. What exactly happened during the final minutes before she disappeared? To answer that question, investigators began reconstructing the timeline in as much detail as possible. Every surveillance recording was reviewed. Every sunset brings the promise of a new dawn. Every known movement was placed in chronological order. The goal was not simply to determine where Sudiksha had gone. It was to identify the exact point where the investigation lost sight of her. According to publicly available information, surveillance cameras documented portions of Sudiksha's movements through the resort during the early morning hours of March 6. Those recordings established a timeline investigators could verify with confidence. But once the group reached the beach, the cameras could no longer provide answers. From that point forward, investigators had to rely on witness statements, physical evidence, and forensic analysis. Among the individuals interviewed, Joshua Reby remained a key witness because he was the last publicly known person seen with Sudiksha before her disappearance. Authorities questioned him multiple times during the investigation. His account was carefully examined and compared against other available evidence. According to statements that have been publicly reported, Reby told investigators that he and Sudiksha entered the ocean together before strong waves pulled them farther from shore. He said both struggled in the water before eventually making their way back toward the beach. He later stated that after returning to shore, he became exhausted and eventually fell asleep. When he awoke, Sudiksha was no longer there. Investigators did not rely solely on that account. As in any major missing person investigation, statements had to be tested against the available evidence. Detectives compared his timeline with surveillance footage, witness interviews, location data, and every other piece of information collected during the investigation. Authorities also examined whether any evidence suggested the involvement of another individual. As of the publicly available findings, investigators had not announced evidence confirming that Sudiksha was abducted or the victim of a criminal assault. At the same time, they continued gathering information and avoided drawing premature conclusions while the investigation remained active. For investigators, the absence of evidence presented its own challenge. There was no publicly confirmed surveillance footage showing Sudiksha after she reached the beach. No confirmed witness publicly reported seeing her leave the shoreline. No definitive physical evidence established exactly what occurred after the final verified moments of the timeline. That gap became the central focus of the investigation. Not because investigators lacked evidence, but because every confirmed fact ended at nearly the same point. Beyond that, the investigation entered unknown territory. As detectives continued reviewing the evidence, another development was unfolding outside the investigation itself. Public interest in the case was growing rapidly. News organizations around the world began following each update. Social media users examined every available photograph, video, and public statement. The disappearance was no longer just a local investigation. It had become an international story. With worldwide attention came countless questions. Some were supported by evidence. Others were driven by speculation. Distinguishing between the two would become one of the greatest challenges surrounding the case. While investigators continued searching for answers, another battle was unfolding, thousands of miles away. It was not taking place on a beach or inside an investigation room. It was unfolding within Sudiksha Konanki's family. As days turned into weeks, the search remained active, but the uncertainty became increasingly difficult to bear. For families of missing persons, uncertainty can be one of the hardest realities to endure. Every phone call brings hope. Every update raises new questions. Every passing day makes it harder to know whether to keep expecting good news or begin preparing for the worst. Sudiksha's parents remained in close contact with investigators throughout the investigation. They followed every development and every public update, while hoping that the next piece of information would finally explain what had happened to their daughter. Despite the extensive search efforts, no definitive answers emerged. Authorities continued examining the available evidence, but the central question remained unresolved. As the investigation progressed, Sudiksha's parents were confronted with a decision that no family ever wants to face. In a formal letter submitted to authorities in the Dominican Republic, they requested that their daughter be legally declared deceased. The request attracted international attention, not because Sudiksha had been found, but because she had not. In the letter, her parents explained that they understood the conclusions reached during the investigation up to that point. According to publicly reported information, authorities had stated that there was no publicly confirmed evidence of foul play, while also indicating that the circumstances were considered consistent with a possible drowning. At the same time, Sudiksha's body had not been recovered. For her family, that painful reality created an impossible situation. The legal process could not move forward without a formal declaration. Yet emotionally, there was still no opportunity to say goodbye. Their request was not presented as proof that every question had been answered, nor did it bring the investigation to an end. Instead, it reflected a deeply personal decision made after months of uncertainty. In the letter, Sudiksha's parents wrote that accepting a legal declaration of death would allow the family to begin addressing the legal matters that remained unresolved, while also starting the long and painful process of mourning. It was a decision made not because the mystery had been solved, but because life had reached a point where uncertainty itself had become unbearable. Even after the letter became public, investigators continued to treat the case with care. The declaration requested by the family did not replace the investigation. It did not establish exactly what had happened during Sudiksha's final moments. And it did not answer the question that had remained unanswered since the morning of March 6. How had a 20-year-old university student disappeared without a definitive explanation? That question continued to shape public discussion around the world. Some people accepted the explanation that had been publicly discussed by investigators. Others believed important questions still remained. What everyone agreed on, however, was that the available evidence left significant gaps in the timeline. And those gaps ensured that the case would continue to receive widespread attention long after the search itself had slowed. As investigators reviewed every confirmed fact once again, attention increasingly shifted toward the unanswered questions. Questions that continue to define this case even today. By this stage of the investigation, authorities had gathered surveillance footage, interviewed witnesses, analyzed digital evidence, examined environmental conditions, and coordinated an extensive search involving multiple agencies. Despite those efforts, one reality remained unchanged. The investigation had established much of Sudiksha Konanki's final known timeline, but it had not established exactly what happened after she was last seen near the beach. That gap continues to define the case. One of the first questions investigators faced involved the timeline itself. Surveillance footage documented Sudiksha's movements through portions of the resort. Those recordings helped investigators verify where she had been and who had accompanied her during the early morning hours. However, once the group reached the beach, the cameras could no longer document what happened. From that point forward, investigators had to rely on witness statements and the physical evidence available. Another question centered on the search. Authorities deployed helicopters, drones, dive teams, boats, and ground personnel across the surrounding area. Ocean specialists also examined currents, tides, and sea conditions to better understand how they might have influenced the search. Yet despite those efforts, Sudiksha was never located. The absence of a recovery became one of the most difficult aspects of the investigation. Without locating the missing person, investigators faced obvious limitations. Certain forensic examinations could not be performed. Some questions could not be answered with certainty. And many conclusions remained dependent on the evidence that was available, rather than the evidence investigators hoped to find. Attention also remained focused on Joshua Ribe, the last publicly known person seen with Sudiksha. Because of that fact alone, investigators devoted significant time to examining his account. According to publicly available information, he participated in multiple interviews and cooperated with investigators throughout the inquiry. Authorities compared his statements with surveillance footage, witness interviews, and other available evidence. As of the latest publicly reported findings, no criminal charges have been announced against him in connection with Sudiksha's disappearance. Investigators have also stated that they have not publicly identified evidence confirming that another person harmed Sudiksha. That distinction is important. An absence of publicly confirmed evidence is not the same as an explanation of exactly what happened. It simply reflects the current state of the investigation. Another question frequently raised by the public concerns the possibility of additional witnesses. The resort was hosting hundreds of guests during spring break. Even so, investigators have not publicly identified any witness who reported seeing Sudiksha after the final confirmed moments of the timeline. Whether someone observed something without realizing its importance, or whether no one was in a position to see what happened, remains unknown. For investigators, these unanswered questions are not unusual. Many missing person investigations contain gaps that cannot immediately be explained. The challenge is determining whether those gaps represent missing evidence or simply moments that no one was able to observe. As of today, several facts remain publicly established. Sudiksha Konanki disappeared during the early morning hours of March 6, 2025. She was last known to be near the beach outside the RIU Republica Resort. An extensive multinational search followed. The FBI assisted Dominican authorities. Her family later requested a legal declaration of death. Beyond those confirmed facts, the central question remains unanswered. Exactly what happened during the final minutes before sunrise? Until new evidence emerges, that question continues to define one of the most closely followed missing person investigations of 2025. Although the investigation has produced many facts, it has not produced certainty, and that distinction explains why this case continues to draw attention long after the search began. In the next chapter, we'll examine where the investigation stands today and why, despite months of work, the mystery remains unresolved. Months have passed since Sudiksha Konanki disappeared from a beach in Punta Cana. During that time, investigators reviewed surveillance footage, interviewed witnesses, analyzed digital evidence, examined environmental conditions, and carried out one of the largest search operations associated with a missing tourist in the Dominican Republic. Those efforts established a detailed timeline of Sudiksha's movements before she disappeared. They also eliminated many early uncertainties that often exist during the first days of a missing person investigation. However, the investigation has not answered its most important question. What happened after Sudiksha was last seen near the shoreline? As of the latest publicly available information, Dominican authorities have not announced that the investigation has identified a definitive explanation for her disappearance. Likewise, no publicly announced criminal charges have been filed in connection with the case. Although search operations were eventually scaled back, the case itself has never been considered forgotten. Investigative records remain available for review should new evidence emerge. Like many unresolved investigations, the possibility of receiving new information remains open. Law enforcement agencies often rely on new witnesses, advances in forensic technology, or previously unavailable evidence to re-examine unresolved cases. Whether any of those developments will occur in Sudiksha's case remains unknown. The disappearance also prompted widespread discussion about travel safety, particularly among families whose children travel abroad during spring break. Universities, parents, and travelers followed the investigation closely, not only because of the mystery surrounding the case, but because it served as a reminder of how quickly an ordinary vacation can become an international emergency. For investigators, however, public attention has never changed the standard required to reach a conclusion. Questions cannot be answered through assumptions. They require evidence. And in this investigation, evidence remains the foundation for every official finding. That is why authorities have consistently distinguished between verified facts and public speculation. As the case continued attracting international attention, countless theories appeared across television programs, online forums, podcasts, and social media. Some attempted to explain the disappearance through environmental conditions. Others suggested criminal involvement. Many relied on incomplete information or unverified claims. Investigators, however, have remained focused on evidence that can be independently examined and corroborated. That approach is common in unresolved investigations. Public discussion may continue for years. Official conclusions can only be based on facts that withstand careful scrutiny. Today, Sudiksha Konanki's disappearance remains one of the most widely discussed missing person cases of 2025. Not because investigators stopped looking, but because, despite an extensive investigation, the evidence available to the public has not fully explained what happened during the final moments of the known timeline. And until that question is answered, the case remains open in the minds of investigators, journalists, and countless people who continue hoping that one day, a new piece of evidence will finally provide the answer that has remained out of reach since the morning of March 6, 2025. In the final chapter, we leave the investigation behind and remember the person at the center of this case, not as a headline or a mystery, but as a young woman whose disappearance continues to leave unanswered questions for everyone who followed her story. Every investigation seeks the same objective: to replace uncertainty with evidence, to reconstruct events with enough certainty that questions become answers. In the case of Sudiksha Konanki, investigators succeeded in establishing much of the timeline leading up to her disappearance. They determined where she had been, who she had been with, how her final known movements unfolded before she reached the beach. But after that point, the investigation encountered a gap that is yet to be fully explained. Despite surveillance footage, witness interviews, digital evidence, ocean current analysis, and an extensive multinational search involving Dominican authorities and assistance from the FBI, no publicly available evidence has fully answered what happened during Sudiksha's final known moments. That is why this case continues to receive attention long after the initial search ended. Not because investigators stopped working, but because the central question remains unresolved. For Sudiksha's family, the investigation has never been measured only by reports or evidence. It has been measured by the absence of certainty. Their decision to request a legal declaration of death reflected the difficult reality they faced after months of waiting. It was a legal step that allowed them to begin addressing practical matters. It was not a declaration that every question had been answered. The investigation and the family's decision represent two different realities. One follows the evidence. The other reflects a family's attempt to move forward after exhausting every available hope. Both can exist at the same time. Cases like this also serve as a reminder of the challenges investigators face when critical evidence is limited. Every unanswered question creates room for speculation, but speculation cannot replace proof. Throughout this investigation, authorities repeatedly emphasized the importance of distinguishing between confirmed facts and assumptions. That distinction remains just as important today. As of the latest publicly available information, the disappearance of Sudiksha Konanki remains without a definitive public explanation. Whether future evidence will change that remains unknown. History has shown that unresolved cases can sometimes be transformed by a single witness, a previously overlooked detail, or advances in investigative technology. Until then, this investigation remains incomplete. Perhaps the greatest lesson from this case is not how suddenly someone can disappear. It is how difficult it can be to explain what happened when the final moments of a timeline are missing. For investigators, those missing minutes remain the center of the case. For Sudiksha's family, they remain the beginning of a loss that still has no complete explanation. And for millions of people who have followed this investigation around the world, they remain the unanswered moments that continue to define one of the most closely watched missing person cases of 2025. If one day new evidence provides a definitive answer, this case may finally reach the conclusion investigators have worked toward since the morning of March 6, 2025. Until that day, the disappearance of Sudiksha Konanki remains not only an international missing person investigation, but also a reminder that even in an age of surveillance cameras, digital records, and advanced forensic science, some mysteries still remain unsolved. What do you believe is the most important unanswered question in this investigation? Please share your thoughts respectfully in the comments. And remember that behind every piece of evidence discussed in this documentary is a real family still living with uncertainty. If you appreciate evidence-based true crime documentaries that focus on verified facts rather than speculation, consider subscribing to the channel for future investigations. Thank you for watching.